You're talking to someone your age, and they're telling a story they clearly think is funny. They're describing how they stayed out until 2 or 3 in the morning, went to bed with their clothes still on, slept a few hours, and then dragged themselves to work the next day, running on coffee and whatever energy they could scrape together. They laugh while they talk about it, shaking their head like the exhaustion was part of the fun, like feeling wrecked afterward was proof the night was worth it. You laugh when they laugh, but you notice the delay right away. While they're talking, your jaw tightens and your shoulders pull in slightly. Instead of imagining the night they're describing, your mind jumps straight to the morning after. You picture your alarm going off too early, the headache that usually doesn't fade until midday, and how long it takes before your focus comes back when you haven't slept enough. You think about how the whole day feels slower and heavier when you've pushed yourself the night before. You realize you're thinking about the recovery before you've even imagined the night. You don't say any of this out loud. You don't want to argue and you don't want to sound like the boring one, so you nod, smile, and add a short comment that keeps the conversation moving, while a clear thought settles underneath everything else. You don't want nights like that anymore. That's when you recognize the feeling, because it's shown up before. You feel older than your age. Not physically, and not because anything hurts, but because your decisions now include details that used to feel optional. When someone talks about staying out late, you automatically think about how it affects the rest of the week. You think about sleep, mood, focus, and how long it takes to feel normal again. You don't just hear the story, they're telling you what happened, and you're mentally walking through what it would cost. That's where the feeling comes from. It doesn't come from burnout, and it doesn't come from some dramatic turning point. It shows up in normal conversations where nothing is wrong, but you realize you're not reacting the same way anymore. You're still listening, still polite, still engaged, but the excitement isn't there. As the conversation goes on, the gap becomes clearer. The person you're talking to keeps circling back to bars, clubs, and last-minute plans. They talk about deciding what to do after midnight and figuring the rest out later. You listen, but you don't relate to the enthusiasm behind it. You're not annoyed, and you're not impressed either. It feels like listening to someone describe a routine you used to have but don't miss. When they ask what you did over the weekend, you pause briefly before answering. Not because you're embarrassed, but because you already know your answer won't match the tone of the conversation. The truth is simple. You went to bed early. You woke up without an alarm, you made coffee and actually sat down to drink it. You met one friend instead of a group and spent a few hours talking about work stress, money decisions, family issues, and things that don't usually come up in loud places. You went home calm instead of wired. You shorten all of that into something like, "Nothing crazy, I just took it easy," and watch their reaction. They nod and say it sounds nice, but there's an assumption underneath it. Like this was a temporary reset rather than the version of life you actually prefer now. You don't correct them. You let the conversation move on, even though you can feel that you're not really connecting in the same way anymore. Later that night, when you're home, the difference becomes more obvious. You're sitting on your couch watching a show you like. You're fully awake and interested, but you keep checking the time. When you see it's 9:42, you immediately calculate how much sleep you'll get if you stay up another hour. You know you'll still function tomorrow, but you also know the day will feel slower and heavier. The show keeps playing, but your attention drifts. You start thinking about the morning, waking up, getting ready, trying to feel alert. You feel a familiar tightness in your chest, the same one you get when you've stayed up later than you should. You pause the episode halfway through, turn off the lights, and get ready for bed. When you lie down, your shoulders relax and your breathing slows almost immediately. The quiet feels better than finishing the show, and the relief is obvious enough that you don't question the choice. You remember when staying up late used to feel exciting, when being tired felt like a fair trade for whatever you'd been doing. Back then, you didn't think about the next day until it arrived. Now, the next day is part of the decision before you even make it. The same thing happens when someone texts you late asking if you want to meet up. You look at the message longer than necessary, not because you're unsure, but because you're already running through the logistics. You picture getting ready, driving, being around noise and small talk, getting home late and waking up groggy.
You think about how the rest of the week will feel afterward. You don't think you don't like the person, you think you don't want that version of the night. So you decline politely. Sometimes you suggest coffee or a walk another day. Sometimes you don't suggest anything. Afterward, you sit alone, reading, scrolling, or doing nothing at all, and you feel calm. The calm tells you the decision was right, even though a small part of you wonders whether this is what being old feels like. But it's just what happens when you've learned that sleep, quiet, and predictability directly affect how you feel. You notice this most clearly in who you end up talking to instead. As the evening goes on, you drift away from people your age and find yourself next to someone older, an aunt's friend, an older coworker, or a neighbor who's been living the same routine for years. Their life sounds boring to most people your age. They talk about waking up early, walking the dog, making the same breakfast every morning, and going to work without much drama. They mention traffic, sore shoulders, or finally fixing something around the house they'd been putting off. There's no attempt to make the stories impressive. When they ask how you've been, they wait for the answer. You talk about work, not in terms of promotions or goals, but in terms of mental load. You describe constantly thinking ahead and managing responsibilities that don't switch off easily. You notice you're speaking more slowly than you were earlier, not because you're filtering yourself, but because you don't feel rushed. They listen and nod. They don't interrupt or try to make it sound better. Nothing they say is especially insightful, but you feel relaxed. That ease makes something clear. There are downsides to this way of being. Group chats fill up with plans that assume late nights and open schedules, and you feel a small tension build as you read them. You turn down invites often enough that you start wondering how it looks from the outside. Sometimes you sit at home on a Friday night, perfectly content, and still feel a flicker of doubt, like you're opting out of something you're supposed to want. It also gets tiring to explain yourself. I don't feel like going out never seems sufficient, so you default to safer reasons, being tired, being busy, even when the truth is simply that you don't enjoy it anymore. Translating your preferences into acceptable excuses becomes its own kind of effort. There's also a quiet sense of loss when you realize certain things no longer appeal to you. You pass a bar you used to love and feel a brief nostalgia, not because you want to go back inside, but because you remember a version of yourself who would have. But there are benefits too, and they're just as concrete. You know exactly what leaves you drained and what leaves you steady. You don't need to test your limits repeatedly to find them. A quiet night at home, a predictable routine, or a long conversation with one person leaves you genuinely rested instead of wired and depleted. You wake up without regret, without piecing together the night before, and that consistency starts to matter more than novelty. You're comfortable with routines that used to sound boring, making the same breakfast, going to bed at the same time, and keeping your weekends simple doesn't feel restrictive anymore. It feels stabilizing. Your mood is steadier, your patience lasts longer, and small inconveniences don't derail you as easily. You're also better at saying no, not defensively and not apologetically, because you trust your own experience. You don't overcommit just to avoid awkwardness, and you don't need your plans to look impressive to feel worthwhile. Feeling older than your age narrows some options, but it sharpens your sense of what actually works for you. You trade volume for clarity, excitement for steadiness, and chaos for calm. And once you've felt the difference, it's hard to unlearn it.